The air was thick with the scent of old memories as I stood there staring at the weathered steps of the house I once called home. My breath caught in my throat, the early morning mist, clinging to the edges of the wooden porch, like a promise half kept. This was the place where everything had started, the laughter and love, the whispered warnings, and the endless nights of doubt. "Let it go, Emily," they had said. Over and over, like a prayer, they whispered into the cracks of my resolve. But standing here now, feeling the weight of history pressing down on me, I knew I couldn't. I couldn't let it go. Not when the truth still echoed in every creaking floorboard and every closed door of this house. I ran my hand along the worn banister, feeling the splinters bite at my skin. It was a small pain, but it grounded me, kept me tethered to the present. My father had built this house with his own 2 hands, each nail, and plank a testament to his stubborn faith and family. And yet after he was gone, those same hands, the hands of my own blood, had tried to erase me from the story. I remembered that day with a clarity that startled me. The room was filled with the musty smell of old paper and the harsh light of midday. My sister had stood there, arms crossed, a smug smile playing at the corners of her mouth as the lawyer read the will. My name had been an afterthought, a footnote to their plans. "Let it go, Emily," she had said then, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's not worth fighting over." But it was worth it, because it wasn't just about the money or the property or the dusty old boxes of heirlooms stacked in the attic. It was about me, my place in this family, my right to be seen and heard. And as much as they wanted me to forget, I couldn't. I wouldn't. The cold seeped into my bones, but I didn't move. I let the memories wash over me like a tidal wave, each one sharp and relentless. The fights, the silences, the way they all looked at me as if I were the problem to be solved rather than the sister who had always been there. I closed my eyes and saw my mother's face worn and tired, her eyes pleading with me to make peace. But even she hadn't seen the rot beneath the surface. Even she had told me in those final days to let it go. "Emily," she had whispered, her hand cold in mine. "It's not worth the pain." But she hadn't known how deep the betrayal went. How my brother had forged papers behind my back. How my sister had smiled sweetly as she stole what was mine. They thought I would stay quiet, that I would fade into the background like a ghost. I opened my eyes and took a step forward, the porch creaking under my weight. The sound was comforting, familiar. A reminder that this was my home too, no matter what they said. In my hand, I clutched a letter, a yellowed scrap of paper that had survived the years hidden away in an old jewelry box. My father's handwriting bold and steady, declaring in no uncertain terms that this house was mine. Proof that I was not the afterthought they tried to make me believe. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the peeling paint and broken shingles. It was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. Because even in its decay, this place was still mine. I could hear the voices of my siblings in my head, their laughter ringing out like a challenge. They thought I would let it go because it was easier, because it was what a good daughter, a good sister would do. But I wasn't the girl they thought I was anymore. I was done playing the part of the obedient child, done swallowing my pride to keep the peace. A car passed by on the street, the sound breaking the spell of silence around me. I wondered what they would say if they saw me now, standing here, ready to take back what they had stolen. Would they still call me foolish? Would they still tell me to let it go? I didn't care. Because for the first time in years, I felt the weight of my own determination settling into my bones like a promise. I turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, but the door gave way, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes danced in the slanting light, and for a moment it felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the hardwood floors. Each step felt like a declaration: this is mine. This is my story. And no matter how hard they tried to silence me, I would not let it go. I walked through the rooms, slowly, letting my fingers brush against the furniture, the walls, the memories etched into every surface. There was so much history here, so much love and loss tangled together. And beneath it all, the quiet certainty that I had a right to be here. In the kitchen, I paused at the old table where we used to sit for family dinners. I could almost hear the clatter of plates, the low murmur of voices, the way my father's laughter would fill the room. I closed my eyes and let the memory settle over me like a warm blanket. They had tried to take this from me, but they couldn't erase what was real. I opened my eyes and looked around, seeing the cracks in the plaster, the faded wallpaper. It was imperfect, but it was mine. And that was enough. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the messages from my siblings, each one colder than the last. They were still trying to convince me to walk away, to let it go, for the sake of family harmony. But what was harmony if it was built on lies? I set the phone down on the table and took a deep breath. I could feel the fear coiling in my stomach, but I didn't let it stop me. I had come too far, lost too much to turn back now. I reached into my bag and pulled out the old letter again. My father's words were a shield, a promise that I wasn't alone in this fight. I traced the ink with my finger, feeling the weight of each word. They said, "Let it go." I whispered to the empty house, my voice steady. But I won't. I can't. The wind rattled the windows, but I stood firm. This was just the beginning, and I knew there would be battles ahead, courtrooms, and cold stares, whispered insults, and broken promises. But I was ready. Because in the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about holding on to what was right, no matter the cost. And I would hold on. I would hold on until it hurt them as much as it had hurt me. Because that was the only way to make them understand that I was done being invisible. I was done being quiet. I stepped back outside the morning sun, warm on my face. I took one last look at the house, at the place where my story had begun. And then I walked away, the letter clutched in my hand like a promise I would never break. Let them say what they wanted. Let them call me stubborn, foolish, bitter. I didn't care, because for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was, and I was done letting them decide for me. The memory of that afternoon had never left me. It was as if it had been etched into my skin, a permanent mark that no amount of time could fade. The sun had been bright too, bright, almost mocking, as it streamed through the windows of the lawyer's office. I remember sitting there, the leather chair cold beneath me, my hands twisting in my lap as I tried to make sense of the words being spoken. My sister sat across from me, her posture perfect, her lips curved in a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked every bit the dutiful daughter, the perfect heir to our family's legacy. And beside her, my brother leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression one of bored indifference. The lawyer's voice droned on each word, another weight pressing down on my shoulders. I tried to focus to hear what he was saying, but all I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears. My name was there, buried in the legal jargon, but it was small, insignificant. An afterthought. And the remainder of the estate shall be distributed, as per the stipulations outlined. I felt my stomach twist. The remainder. That was me. That was what they thought I was worth. When the meeting was over, my sister turned to me, her smile tight. "Emily," she said, her voice so sweet it almost made me sick. "You know this is what's best for everyone. It's time to move on. Move on. Let it go." Words they wielded like weapons, slicing through my defenses, until I felt like I was nothing at all. But I saw the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, the way my brother's eyes flicked to mine and then away. They weren't as confident as they pretended to be. They were afraid that I would see through the lies, that I would find a way to reclaim what was mine. I left the office that day, with my heart pounding in my chest, a silent scream trapped behind my lips. They thought I would let it go because it was easier, because I always had. But they didn't understand that I had spent my entire life learning how to swallow my pride, how to make myself small so they could shine. I was done with that. I went back to my apartment, the walls closing in around me as I paced the floor. The letter from my father was in my pocket, a lifeline I clung to as I tried to figure out what to do next. I knew they wouldn't stop. They would keep pushing, keep twisting the knife, until I had no choice but to walk away. But I couldn't. Not this time. I spent that night going through boxes of old papers, the smell of dust and time filling my lungs. Every piece of paper was a thread, a connection to a past they wanted to erase. I found photographs of birthdays and holidays, my father's handwriting scrawled across the backs, in careful script. I found receipts, letters, tiny pieces of proof that I had always been a part of this family, no matter how much they wanted to deny it. The next morning, I called a lawyer of my own. His name was Thomas, and from the moment he picked up the phone, I could hear the steadiness in his voice, the quiet assurance that he believed me. We met in a small office downtown, the kind of place that smelled of coffee and determination. I told him everything: the will, the meeting, the way they had tried to cut me out of my own history. He listened without interrupting his pen, moving across the legal pad in swift, confident strokes. When I was done, he looked at me over the rim of his glasses and nodded. "Emily, he said you have a case. But it won't be easy. I don't care," I said, my voice trembling but strong. "I can't let them win." He smiled, just a small curve of his lips, but it was enough to give me hope. "Then we'll fight." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again, but hope was a fragile thing. The next time I saw my siblings, it was at a family dinner, meant to smooth things over, as my brother put it. The table was set with our mother's best china, the air thick with forced politeness and barely concealed hostility. My sister sat at the head of the table, her posture as rigid as ever. She raised her glass, her eyes meeting mine with a cold glint. To family, she said, her smile brittle. I lifted my glass, the wine bitter on my tongue. To family, I echoed, though the word felt foreign in my mouth. The conversation was stilted, filled with awkward pauses and careful half-truths. They asked about my work, my health, as if we hadn't been tearing each other apart in private. I played along, but beneath the surface, my anger simmered hot and steady. At the end of the meal, my brother pulled me aside. His hand on my arm was firm, his voice low. "Emily, think about what you're doing," he said, his tone almost gentle. "This isn't worth destroying the family over." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't worried about me, he was worried about himself, about what would happen if I didn't back down. "I'm not the one destroying the family," I said softly. "I'm just making sure they can't destroy me." I walked away before he could answer, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a small victory, but it was mine. Back at my apartment, I stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the darkness. My reflection stared back at me, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't look away. They said let it go, like it was a kindness, like it was the only way to move forward. But what they didn't understand was that letting it go would mean letting go of myself. And I wasn't ready to do that. I took out the letter from my father and read it again, tracing the familiar curves of his handwriting. He had believed in me, in my right to stand my ground. And if he had been here, I knew he would have told me to fight. So I would. Because this wasn't just about money or property, it was about truth. About standing up and saying I was here, I mattered. They didn't want to hear it. They wanted me to fade into the background, to be the quiet sister who never made waves. But I had spent too long drowning in silence. No more. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the box of memories. I didn't know what the future would bring, courtrooms, lawyers, angry phone calls, but I was ready. Because I knew one thing for certain: I would hold on. I would hold on until it hurt them, as much as they had hurt me. The morning air was cool and sharp as I sat at the small wooden desk with my apartment papers spread out in front of me like a map of my life. The coffee in my mug had long gone cold, forgotten in the rush of adrenaline that kept me moving. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me, the years of silence, the whispered lies, the burden of being the one who was always supposed to make peace. But I wasn't here to make peace anymore. The stack of papers in front of me was more than just dusty pages and faded ink. It was proof that I had a right to what was mine, proof that I wasn't going to let them erase me from my own story. I ran my fingers over the rough edges, feeling the texture of the past under my skin. The first time I found them tucked away in an old cardboard box in the back of the closet, I hadn't been sure what I was looking for. I just knew that something didn't feel right, that there were pieces missing from the puzzle they had tried to hand me. So I had started digging, pulling at the loose threads, until the whole tapestry began to unravel. The receipts were there, dates and numbers that didn't add up, tiny inconsistencies that spoke louder than words. There were letters, too, some from my father, others from distant relatives who had always seen me as more than just an afterthought. I read each one slowly, letting the truth sink in, feeling the anger simmer just below the surface. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything they had stolen from me, the memories, the love, the sense of belonging. Every time they told me to let it go, they were really telling me to stop asking questions, to stop demanding what was rightfully mine. And for years, I had listened, but not anymore. I spread the papers out on the table, organizing them into neat piles. Dates, names, signatures, each one a weapon I would use to take back what was mine. I could almost hear my sister's voice in my head, soft and patronizing, telling me I was being dramatic, that I was making trouble for no reason. I pushed the thought away. I wasn't making trouble. I was making things right. The knock on the door startled me. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, there was Thomas, my lawyer, standing there with a file in his hands and a look of quiet determination in his eyes. "Morning, Emily," he said, stepping inside. He looked at the papers spread out across the table and raised an eyebrow. "You've been busy." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I have to be," I said quietly. "I can't let them win." He set the file down and pulled out a chair, sitting across from me. "You won't," he said, his voice steady. "You're stronger than you think." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that I could do this, that I could face them in court, and not be the scared little girl they had always seen me as. But doubt was a stubborn thing clinging to the edges of my mind, like ivy. Thomas reached for one of the papers and studied it for a moment. "This is good," he said finally. "This is really good. It's going to be hard for them to argue with this kind of proof." I let out a shaky breath, some of the tension easing from my shoulders. I don't want to lose," I admitted. "Not again." He looked at me, his gaze softening. "You're not going to lose. Even if the court doesn't see it your way, you're already winning by standing up for yourself. That's something they can't take away." I nodded, blinking back tears. I didn't want to cry, not now, not when I was so close. But his words touched something deep inside me, something I had kept hidden for too long. We spent the next hour going through the papers, Thomas pointing out the pieces that would be most important, the ones that would make the biggest impact. He was methodical, calm, and with every word he spoke, I felt a little bit stronger. When he finally left, I sat back in my chair, staring at the piles of paper in front of me. It felt like I had been fighting this battle for my entire life, but now, for the first time, I had a real chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. I gathered the papers together, sliding them into a folder with careful hands. Each one was a piece of the truth, a piece of the story they had tried to bury. I would take them to court, lay them out for everyone to see, and finally force them to look me in the eye and see the woman they had underestimated. The next day, I went back to the house. The keys felt heavy in my hand. As I pushed open the door, the familiar creak of the hinges greeting me like an old friend. The house smelled of dust and old wood, the scent of memories that refused to die. I walked through the rooms, slowly letting the quiet settle around me. This was where it had all begun, and this was where I would take it all back. In the living room, I found the old family photo album, its leather cover cracked and worn. I flipped through the pages, tracing the faces of people who had once meant everything to me. My father's smile, my mother's gentle eyes, the way my brother and sister used to cling to my arms when we were young. I closed the album and set it aside, my jaw set. They had tried to turn those memories against me, to make me believe that I didn't belong. But the truth was, right here in the walls of this house, and in the papers I held in my hands. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of my reflection in the old mirror hanging in the hallway. My hair was pulled back, my face pale but determined. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. She was stronger, harder, but there was still a flicker of the girl I had been, the girl who had loved this family so fiercely, who had wanted nothing more than to be loved in return. I reached out and touched the glass, my fingers brushing against the cool surface. "I'm not letting it go." I whispered, my voice steady. Not this time. I left the house with my head held high, the folder clutched to my chest like a shield. I knew the road ahead would be hard, that there would be moments when I would doubt myself, when I would want to run. But I also knew that I couldn't stop now. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every time they told me I wasn't enough, every time they made me feel small and insignificant. It was about standing up and saying no more. I was ready. I was ready to fight, to stand in that courtroom, and speak the truth that they had tried so hard to hide. And I would hold on, until it hurt them as much as it had hurt me. Because they needed to know that I was done being quiet. I was done being invisible. I was here. And I wasn't going anywhere. The day after I gathered the final piece of proof, the phone calls started coming. It was as if they could sense that something had shifted, that the balance of power was no longer so firmly in their hands. The first call came early in the morning, before the sun had even fully risen. I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone pressed to my ear, my sister's voice soft and syrupy. "Emily, listen," she said, drawing out my name like a sigh. "This isn't good for anyone. Think about what you're doing." I closed my eyes and let her words wash over me. Once they might have worked. Once I might have heard the concern in her tone and believed it was real. But I'd learned better. I'd seen the truth in the flicker of her eyes, in the way her smile never quite reached them. "I've thought about it," I said quietly. "More than you know." There was a pause, a beat of silence, heavy with all the things we weren't saying. "You're making a mistake," she said finally, her voice hardening. "You're tearing this family apart." I almost laughed at that, the irony of her words sharp and bitter on my tongue. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I'm just refusing to let you keep tearing me apart." I hung up before she could answer, my hands shaking as I set the phone down. The apartment was quiet around me, the early morning light slanting through the windows in soft, forgiving beams. But there was nothing soft about the determination that settled in my chest. The next call came from my brother. His voice was calm, measured, like he was talking to a child who didn't understand the rules of the game. "Emily, you're overreacting," he said. "You're going to regret this." I doubt that I said, my fingers tightening around the phone. "But you might." He didn't like that. I could hear it in the sharp intake of breath, in the way his words turned cold. "This isn't worth it," he said, each word deliberate. "You're going to lose everything." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. I ended the call and let the silence fill the room again, a silence that felt more honest than any of their carefully chosen words. They kept calling. Each time their voices shifted, soft one moment, sharp the next, like they couldn't decide if they wanted to scare me or comfort me. But I had learned to hear the truth in the spaces between their words. I knew the fear behind their anger, the desperation behind their calm. It wasn't about family. It was about control. And they were realizing that for the first time, they couldn't control me. Thomas called that afternoon to check in. His voice was a steady anchor in the swirl of threats and half-truths. "They're going to push back," he said. "You know that, right?" "I know," I said. "I'm ready." "Are you?" he asked gently. "Because once this starts, there's no going back." I looked around my apartment, at the papers spread out across the table, at the memories that clung to every corner of my life. "I don't want to go back," I said finally. "I want to move forward." He was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll keep going," he said. "No matter what they say." The next day, I went back to the house. It was colder now, the wind cutting through my coat as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence greeted me like an old friend, the echoes of the past lingering in every shadow. I walked through the rooms, slowly letting my fingers brush against the worn wood of the banister, the faded wallpaper that had seen so many years. This was mine, I reminded myself. No matter how many times they told me to let it go, this was mine. In the living room, I found the old piano, its keys dusty and silent. My mother had played it every evening, her fingers dancing over the ivory in a melody that had always made me feel safe. I sat down and pressed one of the keys, the sound soft and hollow in the empty room. I remembered the last time we'd all been here together, before the reading of the will had torn everything apart. The laughter, the warmth of family memories that felt both precious and poisoned now. They wanted me to let go of that too, to pretend it had never meant anything. But I wouldn't. I stood and walked to the window, the light slanting through the glass in fractured patterns. Outside the yard was overgrown the garden my father had tended so carefully, now choked with weeds. It felt like a metaphor for everything we had lost, everything they had tried to bury. But I wasn't going to let it stay buried. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the garden, the house, the quiet strength of it all. Proof, I thought. Proof that I was here, that I wasn't going to be erased. As I turned back to the door, I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. But when I turned, there was no one there, just the quiet creak of the old floorboards settling beneath my weight. I shook my head, a wry smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. I was seeing ghosts, I thought. But maybe that was fitting. After all, this house was full of them, memories and regrets and echoes of all the things we'd left unsaid. I left the house with my resolve hardened like steel. The phone calls would keep coming. The whispers and warnings would grow louder. But I was done listening to them, because I had my own voice now, and I was going to use it. Back in my apartment, I set the folder of papers down on the table and sat in the quiet for a long moment. The weight of everything pressed down on me, but I didn't let it crush me. I let it shape me, mold me into someone who couldn't be silenced anymore. They said I was tearing the family apart, but what they didn't understand was that it had already been broken long before I ever found the courage to fight. And if they couldn't see that it wasn't my job to make them. I picked up the phone one last time and dialed Thomas's number. When he answered, I didn't waste any time. "I'm ready," I said, my voice steady. "Let's do this." He didn't hesitate. "I'll file the paperwork first thing tomorrow," he said. "It's time." I ended the call and sat back in my chair, my heart racing with something that felt almost like relief. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time I wasn't afraid. I was done being the one who kept the peace, done being the one who swallowed her words. I was done letting them decide who I was allowed to be. Let them whisper, let them warn. I wasn't going to stop, because they had told me to let it go. But they hadn't realized that holding on was the only way I could finally be free. I had always believed that the truth would set me free, but I never imagined how heavy it would feel in my hands. The papers were all there, every line and signature, a testament to the betrayal I had endured. But as I read through them, again, tracing the familiar scrawl of my father's handwriting, a new realization began to take root in my mind, a twist that threatened to shake the foundation of everything I thought I knew. It started with a letter. Folded and yellowed with age, it was tucked into the back of a drawer, in the old roll-top desk, in the corner of the attic. I had almost missed it, my fingers brushing past it, as I sorted through the piles of forgotten papers. But something made me stop to pull it out and unfold it carefully, the delicate paper crackling under my touch. The letter was addressed to my father, written in a looping, elegant hand I didn't recognize. The words were warm, affectionate, but there was an edge to them, an undercurrent of secrecy, that made my heart race as I read. My mother's name was there, but not as the sender. It was as if the letter was a confession, a glimpse into a world I had never known. I read it once, then again, the words blurring and reforming as the implications sank in. My hands trembled as I set it down, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. This wasn't just about the inheritance, or the house, or the lies my siblings had told. This was about a truth so deeply buried that even I hadn't known to look for it. I sat there in the attic, the dust thick in the air, and let the weight of it settle over me. My father had loved someone else, someone who wasn't my mother. And though the letter didn't say it outright, I could feel the unspoken truth in every line, that the foundation of our family, the family I had fought so hard to protect, was built on a lie. I didn't know what to do with that knowledge. It felt like the ground beneath me was shifting, the walls of the house groaning under the weight of a secret that had lived here longer than I had. I pressed my hand to my chest, trying to calm the frantic beat of my heart. For a moment, I thought about tearing the letter up, about burying it back in the drawer, and pretending I had never seen it. It would be so easy to let it go, to let it slip back into the shadows where it had lived for decades. But I couldn't, because as much as it hurt, this was part of the truth I had been seeking. I took the letter downstairs and sat at the kitchen table, the familiar smell of old wood and faint traces of my mother's cooking filling the air. I read it again in the warm light of the afternoon sun, letting the words wash over me until I could almost hear the voice of the woman who had written them. I didn't know who she was or what had happened to her, but I knew that this was the key to understanding everything, the why behind the betrayal, the how behind the lies. My siblings had fought so hard to keep me quiet, to keep me from asking questions, but they had never suspected that the questions I needed to ask were about more than money. I thought about calling Thomas, about telling him what I had found, but something held me back. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was personal, a wound that cut deeper than any court ruling could touch. I needed time to figure out what it meant and what I was going to do about it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the letter tucked under my pillow, like a secret I wasn't ready to share. My mind was a storm of memories and half-formed thoughts, the pieces of the puzzle shifting and clicking into place in ways that made me dizzy. I remembered the way my father had looked at me when I was a child, the softness in his eyes that had always made me feel safe. I remembered my mother's quiet strength, the way she had held our family together, even when it must have felt like it was falling apart. And I wondered, how much had she known? How much had she sacrificed to keep the peace? In the early hours of the morning, I got up and made myself a cup of tea, the ritual calming my restless thoughts. I sat by the window, watching the first light of dawn creep across the sky, and tried to make sense of the tangle of love and lies that was my family's legacy. When I finally closed my eyes, I dreamed of the house of the walls, whispering secrets of the floors, creaking under the weight of all the things we had never said. And when I woke, I knew what I had to do. I packed the letter away with the other papers, but I didn't hide it. I put it in the folder I would take to court, a silent testament to the truth that was bigger than any of us. My siblings wanted me to let it go, to stop digging, but they didn't understand that I couldn't stop now. Not when I was so close to seeing the whole picture. When I walked into Thomas's office later that day, he looked up from his desk, his brow furrowing at the look on my face. "Emily," he said, concern threading through his calm tone. "What happened?" I took a deep breath and handed him the letter. "I found something," I said quietly. "Something that changes everything." He read it in silence, his eyes narrowing as he took in the words. When he looked up at me, there was a new gravity in his gaze. This is big," he said slowly. "Are you sure you want to bring this into the case?" "It could complicate things." I nodded. "I'm sure. I can't keep pretending. I need to know the whole truth, even if it hurts." He was quiet for a moment, then closed the file and met my eyes. "Okay," he said. "Then we'll use it. But you need to be ready for what this might mean." "I am," I said. And I meant it. As I left his office, the sun was high in the sky, the city humming with life around me. I felt the weight of the letter in my bag, but I didn't feel crushed by it anymore. It was heavy, yes, but it was also a kind of freedom, a door that had been locked for too long finally swinging open. I knew my siblings would be furious when they found out. I knew they would say I was tearing the family apart, that I was digging up things that were better left buried, but I also knew that I couldn't stop, because the truth was all I had left, and I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers. Let them twist and squirm, let them whisper behind my back. I would hold on to this, to every word and every secret, until it hurt them as much as it had hurt me. Because in the end, this wasn't just about the house or the inheritance. It was about who we really were and who we could never be again. And I was done pretending. I was done being the quiet one. I was here, and I wasn't afraid anymore. The courthouse loomed ahead of me, a fortress of stone and glass that glowed dully in the gray morning light. My palms were damp with sweat as I walked up the steps, each one feeling heavier than the last. My heart pounded in my chest, But I refused to let the fear show on my face. Today wasn't about fear, it was about fighting back. Thomas met me at the doors, his expression calm and focused. He wore a dark suit that made him look even taller, more imposing. He gave me a small nod, and I took a deep breath, letting his quiet confidence steady me. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low. I swallowed and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." He smiled faintly. "You're stronger than you know, Emily." I held on to those words as we stepped into the courthouse, the echo of our footsteps swallowed by the high ceilings and marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and dust, and the low murmur of voices reminded me that this wasn't just my fight anymore. There were eyes everywhere, strangers and family alike, waiting to see what I would do. We entered the courtroom, and I felt my breath catch at the sight of my siblings, already seated at the long table across from us. My brother's face was a mask of polite indifference, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes when he met my gaze. My sister's lips were pressed into a thin line, her hands folded neatly in her lap. They looked like the perfect picture of calm, but I knew better. I knew the fear that lay just beneath the surface, the desperation they tried so hard to hide. I let that knowledge settle over me like armor as I took my seat. The judge entered, his robe flowing around him like a shroud. He was an older man with kind eyes and a voice that carried the weight of years. He looked at each of us in turn, and I felt his gaze linger on me for just a moment longer than the others. I wondered what he saw: a scared woman fighting for scraps, or someone finally ready to claim what was hers. Thomas opened the proceedings with the calm, measured tone that had always reassured me. He laid out the facts of the case, the will, the discrepancies, the evidence we had gathered. As he spoke, I watched my siblings carefully, noting every flicker of their eyes, every shift in their posture. They looked so sure of themselves, so sure that the truth could be twisted and hidden away. But they hadn't counted on me. They hadn't counted on the fire that had been building in my chest for years. When it was their lawyer's turn to speak, he rose with a practiced ease, his voice smooth and confident. He talked about family harmony, about the importance of moving on and letting go. His words were honeyed, but there was an edge to them, a veiled threat that made my skin crawl. I could feel my sister's eyes on me, her gaze sharp and accusing. She wanted me to flinch, to look away, but I didn't. I held her gaze and let her see the determination in my eyes, the quiet promise that I wasn't backing down. Thomas leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. Let them talk. We'll have our chance." I nodded, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table. I could feel the weight of every word, every glance, but I refused to let it crush me. When it was my turn to speak, my voice was low but steady. I told my story: the betrayal, the stolen memories, the fight to be heard. I didn't sugarcoat it or try to make it sound prettier than it was. I let the truth stand on its own, raw and unpolished. I could see the impact in the judge's eyes, in the way he leaned forward slightly as I spoke. My sister shifted in her seat, her composure cracking just enough for me to see the fear there. My brother looked away, his jaw tight. It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep me going. Thomas took the letter from my father and laid it on the table, his fingers light on the paper, as if he understood the weight it carried. "This," he said quietly, "is the heart of the matter. This is the truth they tried to bury." The courtroom was silent as the judge read the letter, the words hanging in the air like a prayer. I watched my siblings closely, saw the way their faces paled as the truth was laid bare. For the first time, they couldn't hide. For the first time, the lies they had told were nothing more than dust in the air. When the judge looked up, his expression was grave. "This changes everything," he said softly. "We'll need to review all of this carefully." My sibling's lawyer tried to argue, his voice rising in desperation, but the judge held up a hand, silencing him with a single look. "Enough," he said firmly. "We will hear the truth here." I felt something loosen in my chest, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, finally slipping free. This wasn't the end, I knew. There would be more hearings, more battles, but this was the first crack in the wall they had built around me, and I would take it. As we left the courtroom, Thomas put a hand on my shoulder. "You did good today," he said quietly. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "It's not over," I said. "No," he agreed. "But you're winning, and they know it." Outside, the air was cold and clean, the sky a pale blue that felt like a promise. My siblings walked ahead of us, their heads bent together, in low conversation. I watched them go, the weight of everything we had been, and everything we had lost, heavy on my shoulders. But I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter, the silent sister. I felt like someone who had finally found her voice, and I wasn't going to let them take it away. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, feeling the steel in my spine, the quiet fury in my heart. This was just the beginning. There would be more fights, more sleepless nights, more moments when I wondered if I was strong enough. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let it go. I was going to hold on until it hurt them as much as it had hurt me. Because this was my life, my family, my truth. And I wasn't going to stop until they saw it too. The days after the hearing passed, in a blur of tense phone calls and restless nights. I could feel the pressure building around me, like the walls were closing in, but I refused to back down. I had come too far, and the truth was too important to let go now. My siblings stopped pretending to be polite. The calls were no longer veiled in concern or false kindness. My brother's voice was sharp, his words clipped as he accused me of tearing the family apart. My sister's messages were colder, laced with threats she didn't bother to disguise. "Think about what you're doing," she said in one voicemail, her voice tight with anger. "You're going to destroy everything." I sat at the kitchen table, her words echoing in my head as I stared at the stack of papers in front of me. My father's letter lay on top, the familiar script, a steady reminder of why I was doing this. I wasn't destroying anything. I was saving what was left of me. Thomas called every day, his calm voice a lifeline in the chaos. "They're trying to break you down," he said one afternoon. "They think if they push hard enough, you'll walk away." I looked out the window at the street below, the early winter light, casting long shadows across the pavement. "They don't know me anymore," I said softly. "I'm not the girl who used to let them decide everything." He was silent for a moment, then said, "Good. Because this is going to get harder before it gets better." He was right. The next court date was set, and the days leading up to it felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. My sibling's lawyer filed motions to dismiss, to delay, to bury me under endless paperwork. But Thomas pushed back, with the same quiet determination he had shown from the start. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark living room, the folder of evidence on the table in front of me, and let the memories wash over me. I thought of birthdays in this house, of the way my father's laughter had filled every corner. I thought of my mother's gentle voice, of the warmth that used to wrap around us all, like a blanket. And then, I thought of the cold distance that had grown between us, of the lies that had twisted that warmth into something sharp and painful. They had said, "Let it go," so many times, but what they really meant was, "Stay quiet." I closed my eyes and let the anger steady me. I wouldn't stay quiet anymore. The next morning, the courthouse was crowded, the low hum of voices filling the air like a swarm of bees. I walked in with my head high, Thomas at my side, and ignored the eyes that turned to follow me. My siblings were already there, sitting together in a tight line of polished clothes and forced smiles. My sister's eyes met mine, her expression hard. I held her gaze and didn't flinch. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings began, a slow, deliberate march through evidence and testimony. My brother's lawyer spoke first, his voice calm and patronizing, as he painted me as the problem, the one who couldn't let go of old grievances. But when Thomas stood, the tone of the room shifted. His words were measured, his delivery precise, as he laid out the facts piece by piece. He spoke of my father's letter, of the inconsistencies in the will, of the quiet manipulations that had left me fighting alone. I watched my siblings, carefully saw the way their composure cracked each time Thomas revealed another truth. My sister's jaw tightened, her fingers white around the edge of the table. My brother shifted in his seat, his eyes darting to the judge and back to me. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, my hands steady at my sides. The room seemed to hold its breath as I began. I told them everything: how I had found the letter, how I had pieced together the quiet betrayals and half-truths. I didn't let the tremor in my voice stop me. I spoke of my father's promises, of the home he had built, and the family he had tried to keep whole. And I spoke of how they had taken it all away, piece by piece, until I was left with nothing but the determination to fight. When I finished, the silence was deep and heavy. The judge looked at me with a kind of quiet respect, and I felt a flicker of hope in my chest. As we left the courthouse that day, Thomas turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You've done more than most people ever would," he said quietly. "You've faced them, and you haven't backed down." I looked up at the courthouse steps, the cold wind whipping around us. "I'm not done yet," I said. "Not until they understand how much it's cost me." And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about them anymore. It was about me, about finding my voice, about refusing to be erased. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I knew I was strong enough to see it through to the end. The days after the courtroom showdown blurred together, each one a mixture of tension and a quiet sense of victory. The ruling wasn't final yet, but I had felt it in the courtroom that day. The shift in power, the crack in the wall my siblings had built so carefully around the truth. My brother stopped calling. My sister's messages went from threats to icy silence, the kind of silence that was more chilling than any words could ever be. I could almost feel the distance between us growing, a cold expanse that I knew could never be bridged. Thomas checked in every day, his calm voice a steady presence in the chaos. "They're regrouping," he said during one call. "They're hoping you'll get scared and walk away." "I'm not," I said. And I meant it. At night, I sat in my apartment with the papers spread out around me, the letter from my father at the center like a talisman. I thought about the man who had built this family, the man who had believed in something bigger than money or property. And I thought about how easily that belief had been twisted, turned into a weapon, by the people who were supposed to love me. I wondered what he would think of all this, if he would be proud of me for fighting, or if he would mourn the cracks that had formed in the family he had tried so hard to protect. I wanted to believe he would understand, that he would see that I wasn't fighting for money or revenge. I was fighting for the truth. One afternoon, I went back to the house. The air was cold and sharp, the sky a pale winter blue. I walked through the rooms slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. In the living room, I paused by the old piano, my fingers brushing the dusty keys. I remembered how my mother used to play in the evenings, her music filling the air with warmth. I pressed one key, the soft note lingering in the quiet, and let myself remember the girl I used to be. The girl who believed in family, who believed that love was enough. I wasn't that girl anymore. I had learned that love without honesty was just another lie. I stood there for a long time, letting the memories wash over me, and then I turned and left. I didn't take anything with me, not the photographs, not the worn blankets that still smelled faintly of home. I didn't need them anymore. The house was mine, but the past wasn't. Back in the apartment, I started packing up the evidence. The next hearing was coming fast, and Thomas wanted everything ready. I could feel the weight of it all in my hands as I slid each paper into the folder, the final pieces of a story they had tried so hard to bury. That night, I lay awake in the darkness, the city lights flickering outside my window. My phone buzzed, once my sister's number on the screen, a single line of text that said nothing and everything: "Stop this." I stared at it for a long moment, then turned the phone off and let it fall silent. There was nothing left to say. In the days that followed, I felt the shape of my life start to change. Friends who had once stayed silent reached out, their voices soft with sympathy, with tentative support. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me that I wasn't as alone as I had felt for so long. I met Thomas at the courthouse a few days later, the final folder of evidence in my hands. He looked at me, his expression thoughtful. "You know this is it, right?" he said. "After this, there's no going back." "I know," I said quietly. "I don't want to go back." He nodded, a small smile on his lips. "Good. Because you've come too far to turn around now." As I walked into the courthouse, the weight of everything I had lost and everything I had fought for settled around me like a cloak. My siblings were there, their eyes cold and hard, but I didn't look away. I let them see me, let them see the woman they had tried so hard to erase. I took my seat beside Thomas, my hands steady on the table. The judge entered the room, falling into a respectful silence. I could feel my heart pounding, but I didn't let it shake me. I was here. I was ready. The proceedings began a slow march through the evidence that had once felt like the only thing holding me together. I listened as Thomas laid it out, piece by piece, watched the judge's expression shift from neutrality to quiet understanding. My sibling's lawyer spoke again, his voice sharp and desperate. He tried to paint me as vindictive, tried to make me out to be the villain in a story that wasn't mine to tell. But each time he spoke, his words felt smaller, weaker, because the truth was stronger than any lie he could weave. When it was my turn to speak, I stood with the letter in my hands, my voice low and steady. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I told the truth about my father, about the love and betrayal that had defined my family, about the quiet, unspoken war that had been waged in every corner of that house. When I finished, the judge was silent for a long moment. And then he nodded his eyes, meeting mine with something like respect. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That will be enough for today." As I left the courtroom, the cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't flinch. I took a deep breath, the sharp scent of winter filling my lungs, and let it settle me. The fight wasn't over. There was still one more step, one more hearing, one final decision that would close this chapter of my life for good. But as I walked down those steps, the cold stone beneath my feet, I knew that no matter what happened next, I had already won something no one could take away. I had found my voice, and I wasn't afraid to use it. The courthouse was quieter on the morning of the final hearing. The usual chatter and shifting of papers seemed muted, as if everyone could feel the weight of what was about to happen. I walked up the stone steps with Thomas beside me, the cold air biting at my cheeks, but doing nothing to dampen the steady burn in my chest. Inside, the hallways echoed with the click of my boots, each step a reminder that I was no longer the woman who would let herself be pushed aside. I clutched the folder to my chest, the last piece of my father's legacy, of my own place in the world. Thomas gave me a small, encouraging smile as we waited outside the courtroom doors. "You've done everything you could," he said quietly. "No matter what happens today, you've shown them who you are." I nodded, my throat tight, but my resolve firm. "I'm not afraid anymore," I whispered. When the doors opened and we stepped inside, my siblings were already there. My brother's jaw was set, his eyes hard. My sister's expression was a careful mask, but I could see the fear in the tightness around her mouth, in the way her fingers fidgeted in her lap. I didn't look away. I wanted them to see me, to see that I was done being silent. The judge entered, his expression serious as he took his seat. The room fell into a hushed silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. I felt it in my bones, the finality of it, the sense that this was the moment everything had been building towards. Thomas began, his voice calm and measured, as he walked the judge through our final pieces of evidence. The letter from my father, the documents that proved the quiet theft of my inheritance, the careful manipulation of a family that had once been my whole world. Each word was a hammer striking at the foundation my siblings had built out of lies, and with each strike, I saw the cracks forming in their composure. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, my hands steady, as I lifted my father's letter for the judge to see. My voice was low but clear, the words coming easily after so many nights of rehearsing them in the quiet of my apartment. "I'm not here because I want to tear my family apart," I said, my eyes on the judge, but my words meant for the people who had spent so long trying to silence me. "I'm here because they already did that, and I'm the only one who's willing to tell the truth." My sister looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line. My brother's gaze flicked to the floor, his shoulders tense. I kept going. I told the judge about the years of quiet betrayal, about the way they had tried to rewrite the story of our family, to leave me out of it. I spoke of my father, of the way his words in this letter were a final act of love proof that I was part of this family, whether they wanted to admit it or not. When I finished, the room was silent. Even the lawyer my siblings had hired looked away, his arguments turned to dust by the simple power of the truth. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. He looked at each of us in turn, and when his eyes met mine, there was something there, something that felt like understanding. "You've been heard," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "And that matters." He didn't render a decision right then. The ruling would come in a few days, he explained, once he had reviewed everything one final time. But as I sat back down, the tension in my shoulders easing, I knew that it didn't really matter what the final decision was, because I had already won. Outside the courthouse, the cold air was sharp and bright. I stood on the steps for a long moment, breathing it in and letting the weight of the morning settle into my bones. Thomas stood beside me, his hands in his pockets. "You did it?" he said quietly. I nodded. I did. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole, like I had put the last piece of a puzzle into place and could finally see the picture for what it was. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it. I didn't need to hear my siblings' excuses or threats anymore. I didn't need them to tell me who I was. I walked down the steps, the city bustling around me, and felt the freedom in every step. This wasn't the end of the story. There would be more fights, more decisions, more days when the weight of it all felt like too much. But I knew now that I could carry it. I stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and looked back at the courthouse, the sunlight glinting off the windows. It looked smaller, somehow less like a fortress, and more like just another building in a city full of them. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, a quiet smile on my lips, because I knew who I was. And no matter what happened next, I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me again. The final ruling came on a crisp winter morning, the sky pale and bright above the courthouse. I stood on the steps with Thomas at my side, my breath clouding in the cold air. The papers in my hand felt lighter than I expected, even though I knew the weight of what they represented. Inside the courtroom was hushed. My siblings sat together, their faces tight with strain. My sister wouldn't meet my eyes, and my brother's jaw was clenched, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. For so long, they had believed I would break under the pressure, that I would let it go like I always had before. But today, I was done being the one who swallowed her voice. The judge entered and took his seat, the finality of it settling over the room like a heavy blanket. He read through the decision, slowly, his voice even and calm. The words blurred together for a moment, so many legal phrases and careful declarations, but the meaning was clear. The house was mine. My father's wishes were honored, and every lie they had, told every attempt to erase me, was laid bare for everyone to see. I felt the tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Not here. I sat tall in my seat, my hands folded neatly in front of me. This moment wasn't about tears. It was about the quiet strength I had found in the ruins of what they had tried to destroy. The judge's final words echoed in the room, each one a nail in the coffin of their carefully constructed narrative. When he looked at me, his gaze was kind but resolute. "This court recognizes your right to what is yours," he said quietly, "and your courage in standing up for it." I nodded, once my throat too tight to speak. Around me, the silence was thick and absolute. After the ruling, I walked out of the courthouse without looking back at my siblings. I didn't need to see the anger in their eyes or hear the cold words they would throw at my back. I knew them too well to expect anything else. Thomas walked beside me, his steps steady and calm. "You did it?" he said softly. "You held on until the end." I let out a breath. I hadn't realized I'd been holding the cold air filling my lungs like a promise. "I couldn't let it go," I said quietly. "Not when it was all I had left." He nodded. "I think you found more than you lost." We paused on the steps, the city stretching out before us, alive and indifferent. For a long moment, I just stood there, feeling the weight of it all begin to slip from my shoulders. The fight was over, and in the quiet that followed, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time: peace. When I finally went back to the house, it was late afternoon. The winter sun cast long shadows across the porch, and the air was sharp with the scent of snow. I unlocked the door slowly, the familiar creak of the hinges greeting me like an old friend. Inside, the rooms were quiet, filled with the soft light of the setting sun. I walked through each one slowly, my fingers brushing the worn wood of the banister, the cool glass of the windows. Every corner felt different somehow, not because the house had changed, but because I had. In the kitchen, I paused by the old table, the place where so many family dinners had begun and ended in silence. I let my hand rest there for a moment, feeling the warmth of memories that would never be erased no matter how hard they had tried. I took out the letter from my father and read it one last time, the words familiar and comforting. It was more than a document, it was a promise. A reminder that I had a place here and that no one could take it from me again. I folded it carefully and set it on the table, a quiet tribute to the man who had built this house and the woman I had become within its walls. As night fell, I lit a single candle in the living room, the soft glow filling the space with a gentle light. I stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet wash over me. There was no more shouting, no more threats, just the soft sigh of the wind against the windows and the slow, steady beat of my own heart. I thought about everything I had lost and everything I had found. I thought about the woman I had been when this all began, so afraid of being alone, of being nothing without their approval. And I thought about the woman I was now, stronger, quieter, but unbreakable. This wasn't the ending I had imagined all those years ago, but it was the one I had fought for. And in the quiet of that old house, I realized it was enough. I stepped outside the cold air biting at my skin and looked up at the stars just beginning to pierce the darkness. I smiled a small, quiet smile that felt like the first breath of spring after a long, hard winter. Because they had told me to let it go. But I had held on. I had held on until it hurt them, until it healed me. And in the end, that was all I had ever really needed. I turned back to the house, the warm light spilling out through the doorway, and walked inside, ready to begin again.